Hey everyone and welcome. I am so incredibly excited you're joining me for this explainer today because we are embarking on a massive, frankly mind-bending journey together. We're going to track the entire grand sweep of human history. We're talking from our very first wobbly steps on Earth all the way to the bloody, earth-shattering revolutions of the modern age. But don't worry, we are not just going to memorize dates and names. Instead, we're exploring something so much more fascinating, the evolution of power. How in the world did we go from being these wandering nomadic hunter-gatherers to the subjects of massive, sprawling empires, and then, eventually, to citizens actually demanding our own rights? To really understand how power changed us, we actually have to look at how civilization literally altered our biology. Okay, get this. 5'3", that was the average height of a man living in the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk right around 4000 BCE. Now, before we all settled down into these cities and started relying on agriculture and grain, hunter-gatherer men were around 5'9". They were basically the super athletes of their time. But once we started farming, harvesting wheat and barley with hand mills all day, our diets changed, our daily labor completely changed, and we physically shrank. I mean, imagine losing half a foot of height just for the guarantee of a stable meal. We basically traded our physical stature for the security of a society. It's wild, but it brilliantly shows that civilization didn't just change where we lived, it fundamentally altered the very essence of what it meant to be human. Alright, so here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, survival to society. Second, the blueprint of control. Third, the philosopher kings and conquerors. And finally, number 4, the people push back.
Let's jump right into part 1, Survival to Society, the Dawn of Civilization.
What's truly staggering to think about is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of time it actually took just to get to what we call civilization. Look, 3 billion years ago, we were literally just floating atoms. 6 million years ago, the first hominids finally emerge. About 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus heads out of Africa. But it isn't until 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, right there nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that we finally figure out agriculture. In places like Uruk, we became these incredibly inventive but totally landlocked farmers. We figured out how to actually create our own food source instead of endlessly chasing it around. And because of that, populations absolutely exploded. We're talking over 50,000 residents living in a single city. But, as you can imagine, this population boom created a brand new, massive problem for humanity. How exactly do you manage tens of thousands of people in one confined space without the whole thing descending into total chaos? Which brings us nicely to part 2, the blueprint of control, managing the masses. So, here is how ancient Egypt solved that massive logistical nightmare. They structured their entire society exactly like their most famous architecture, a giant pyramid. Down at the very bottom, you've got the peasants and enslaved people doing all the grueling, back-breaking manual labor. Just above them are the artisans, the merchants, scribes, and soldiers. Up near the top, you have the bureaucrats and nobles managing all the complex logistics. And at the absolute pinnacle, the pharaoh. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that every single person in this pyramid existed for one strict, undeniable purpose: to serve the pharaoh. From the poorest farmers paying their taxes and crops to the highly educated scribes recording the ruler's daily thoughts, this entire civilization was basically a giant engine built for one thing: ensuring the pharaoh's immortality in the afterlife. Now let's jump over to China and see how this blueprint of control builds. While Egypt used the promise of religious immortality to justify absolute power, the Zhou dynasty, which started around 1046 BCE, used this fascinating concept called the Mandate of Heaven. The core idea was simple, but incredibly effective for keeping people in line. It went like this: Heaven grants the emperor the right to rule, and there can only be one emperor at a time. But unlike the pharaohs in Egypt, there was a catch here, and it was a big one. The emperor's personal virtue determined his right to rule, which meant the right to power was not permanent. If floods or famines or huge earthquakes struck, well, that meant the heavens were actively withdrawing their blessing, and the people suddenly had the right to support a brand new dynasty. It's such a cool parallel to Egypt. They're still using divine blessing to justify total control, sure, but with a built-in cosmic performance review for the guy in charge. Meanwhile, over in Babylon, right around 1772 BCE, King Hammurabi took a slightly more literal, practical approach to controlling his people. He carved 282 laws into this massive 7-foot stone slab. But listen, do not confuse these ancient laws with justice as we think of it today. Hammurabi's code was all about strict class value. There was absolutely no illusion of equality here. If you broke a noble's bone, your bone was getting broken. No questions asked. But if you broke a plebeian's bone or a slave's bone, you just paid a quick fine and walked away. These early legal systems were quite literally etched in stone to ensure that every single person knew exactly what their life was worth in the social hierarchy. So up to this point, we have these massive populations, organized by super rigid class systems and divine mandates. But what happens when these tightly controlled civilizations start looking outward, at each other?
That brings us to part 3, the philosopher kings and conquerors.
Let's anchor this next part of our narrative right here with the legendary Greek philosopher Plato. He was looking around at how governments were being run, and he gave this incredible warning. He basically said that a true navigator has to actually study the seasons, the sky, the stars, the winds, if he is really fit to control the ship. Plato thought it was just completely barbaric to let randomly selected, totally untrained citizens make massive life-or-death decisions for the state. Instead, he fiercely advocated for what he called a philosopher king, a ruler dedicated entirely to wisdom, strict logic, and justice. So the ultimate question of this entire era suddenly became, who should actually hold ultimate power? Should it be one incredibly enlightened individual, or should it be the chaotic, sprawling masses?
And you can actually see this exact conflict playing out brilliantly in ancient Greece. Just look at the two absolute extremes here. On one side, you have Sparta. This was a brutally militaristic society where young boys were quite literally taken from their families early on for harsh, unforgiving combat conditioning. And this whole warrior lifestyle was completely supported by a massive class of enslaved people called helots. Then, on the complete flip side, you have Athens, a highly complicated, beautifully chaotic democracy. Get this, they literally used a physical machine called the Kleroterion, filled with little tubes and balls, to randomly select 500 normal citizens for their council. Meanwhile, their main assembly had up to 30,000 citizens just shouting at each other to vote on laws and generals. It was total, uncompromising military discipline on one side versus sprawling, loud democratic chaos on the other.
Well, it turns out Plato's grand idea of the enlightened philosopher king almost did come true, but with a heavily, heavily militarized twist. Enter Alexander the Great. Tutored since he was a child by Aristotle, who was basically the father of the scientific method, Alexander took that absolutely world-class education and combined it with a completely ruthless military ambition. I mean, just look at how fast this happens. He's born in 356 BCE, he takes power at just 20 years old. By 331 BCE, he has completely shattered the massive Persian army at the Battle of Gaugamela, and by the time he dies mysteriously in Babylon in 323 BCE, at only 32 years old, mind you, his lightning-fast conquests had already spread Greek culture, philosophy, and immense power across the entire known world.
Now the Romans were watching, and they definitely learned from this blueprint of rapid conquests. And honestly, nobody executed it better than Julius Caesar. In 52 BCE, Caesar was given the monumental task of conquering the Celtic tribes of Gaul. When those Gauls eventually retreated to the highly fortified town of Alesia, Caesar didn't just blindly attack the walls. No, he built his own circumvallation wall, completely surrounding the town to just slowly starve them out. But here's the genius part. Knowing that huge Gallic reinforcements were rushing in from behind him, he built a second, outward-facing wall to defend his own besieging army. He literally trapped himself in a giant donut of walls just to win the battle. It's crazy. This brilliant, utterly ruthless victory gave him so much unprecedented popularity and power that he eventually marched his own army across the Rubicon River, completely defied the Roman Senate, and declared himself dictator for life. But hey, if we're talking about the sheer, terrifying scale of historical conquest, we have to pause for a second on this shocking biological statistic. 8%. That is the actual percentage of modern men living in South Asia today who are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. Let that sink in. Back in the 13th century, Genghis united the Mongolian tribes and just launched an unstoppable wave of cavalry-led warfare that completely wiped out entire kingdoms from China all the way to the Caspian Sea. They weaponized psychological terror, they used human shields, and they brought total destruction to build the largest contiguous empire in the history of the world. His genetic footprint today is just a stark, living reminder of his absolute, brutal dominance.
So what does this all mean? The crucial takeaway here is this. When we look back at men like Caesar and Genghis Khan, we see the ultimate reality of historical governance perfectly captured centuries later by the philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. In his famous manifesto, The Prince, he basically wrote that it is much safer to be feared than loved. Think about it. Why did the peasants pay their ridiculous taxes? Why did they serve and die in the armies? It was fear. Fear of their rulers, sure, but also a deep fear of what the barbarian hordes would do to them if those rulers ever fell. For most of human history, plain and simple, fear was the ultimate blueprint of control. But nothing lasts forever, right? Eventually, these massive fear-based empires are going to start fracturing from the bottom up.
And that brings us to our final act. Part 4. The People Push Back. The Age of Revolution.
Surprisingly enough, the actual catalyst for this massive pushback against power was a biological nightmare. The bubonic plague absolutely swept through Europe and Asia via the Silk Road and trade ships. The result was an unfathomable death toll somewhere between 75 to 200 million people. It's horrific. But this catastrophe had a profound, completely accidental side effect on the global balance of power. With so many people tragically dead, laborers and farmers were suddenly in incredibly short supply. Think of it like the ultimate, albeit deeply tragic, workers' strike. For the very first time in history, the everyday people actually had the leverage to demand better rights, better treatment, and they even demanded to keep more of the crops they farmed. The absolute suffocating grip of the elite was finally slipping.
We really start seeing this pushback get formalized in law over in England back in 1215. King John was facing some intense, boiling pressure from his barons. They were completely fed up with his absolute, unchecked power, so they backed him into a corner and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. And look at these points they demanded: the right to a fair trial, due process of the law, and habeas corpus, which basically means the government actually has to provide a lawful reason before they can just lock you up in a dungeon. This was absolutely revolutionary. It laid the early groundwork for our modern legal freedoms, and it proved, once and for all, that even a king was subject to the law.
Fast forward a bit, and that powerful momentum eventually crosses the Atlantic Ocean. On July 4th, 1776, American patriots totally shattered those ancient divine right and mandate of heaven models with one single, incredibly energetic phrase. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. I mean, talk about a total paradigm shift. Power longer flowed down from a god to a king and then to the people. Now, power originated with the people. And through grueling warfare and clever guerrilla tactics, those Americans actually defeated the mighty British Empire and set up a working constitutional democracy.
Inspired by seeing the Americans pulled us off, the French decided they'd absolutely had enough of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette telling them to just let them eat cake. But the French Revolution is the perfect example of how the push for equality can wildly, violently escalate. It starts off as this triumphant push for rights with the famous storming of the Bastille prison. Then, the execution of the king. But the massive power vacuum that followed led to a guy named Maximilien Robespierre taking over. And what started as a beautiful cry for freedom quickly morphed into the horrific reign of terror, where thousands of people were executed just for alleged crimes against the revolution. Eventually, the people turned on Robespierre and executed him too. They tried a five-man directory to rule, but finally, totally exhausted by years of chaos, they just allowed General Napoleon Bonaparte to overthrow the government and install himself as a dictatorial emperor. The grand quest for freedom had somehow circled right back around to absolute control.
Which leaves us right here with this final, incredibly provocative question. Think about it. Over millions of years, we evolved. We learned to farm. We built towering cities. We submitted to pharaohs and kings out of sheer fear and necessity. And eventually, we stood up and fought back to claim our own natural rights. But as history repeatedly shows us, democracies can absolutely fall to tyrants, and tyrants inevitably spark bloody revolutions. So, as we look ahead to the future of our massive, ongoing human experiment, if absolute control inevitably leads to revolution, what system of power will humanity build next? Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the Explainer today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you guys next time.